Hello and welcome to the October Roundtable. So I'm excited to usher in fall with our regular guests, my colleague John Pasalis at Velocity Realty in Toronto, and our partner Steve Saretsky at Oakland Realty in Vancouver. Hi guys, how's your fall so far?
It's been great. Yeah, the weather is in Vancouver. We haven't had like a drop of rain, knock on wood, which is extremely abnormal. So I probably just jinxed it, but no complaints other than an incredibly slow housing market, which we'll get into.
John, I know you like your fashions. I feel like
I
you like
do.
fall.
I'm struggling. I like the fall clothing. I like the flannel suit, so it's still a bit warm for that. So but it's okay. We'll take that. We'll take it now that we got it. It's fine.
Right. Great. So let's start again, just an unbelievably interesting time for real estate markets across Canada and even in the world. John, let's start with you in Toronto on what you're seeing in terms of maybe the latest stats or even what you're experiencing on the ground in Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar trends. I mean, again, sales are, I feel like we're repeating ourselves because the dynamics are very similar, but sales again are basically at a 20-year low. I mean, sales in September actually declined from August, which is not typical. Inventory still very tight. We have like 2 months of inventory for houses. Prices have stabilized. So even both average and median prices since July have kind of plateaued for 3 months, which I think is kind of interesting given given the fact that demand's so low. But again, I think the key issue is that there's not a lot to look at. I mean, we have quite a few buyers, and the challenge right now is like there's literally like so few homes to look at. I mean, I was out of town and we had a client that just moved here and was stressed because they couldn't find a home, and their budget's reasonable. They're looking like the $2 million price range. And I was out of town when I saw their email, like, what are they talking about? How can they not find a home? And then you look downtown and you're like, holy crap, there's like 4 homes for them to look at because, once you filter out, the complete dumpy homes, the ridiculously overpriced homes, the triplexes, there's just like not a lot, and they're not unrealistic in their criteria. It's just like there's not a ton of inventory, and the nice homes sell fast and are getting bidding wars here, which is confusing for some buyers. And then you have other homes that just sit on the market for a couple months. So it's a weird market. Yeah, it's a weird
It sounds like a continuation of what you were saying from last month. So sales are down by a historic level, but listings are staying down, and that's a little bit unexpected.
Yeah, exactly.
And Steve, what are you finding in Vancouver?
Honestly, it's like the exact same thing. It's funny. I was just like flipping through some charts and data when John was talking there. Because it's like you kind of have like your anecdotal, right? Like, so it's a lot of times like you're in the weeds, you're running a day-to-day real estate business. And so you're just like anecdotally, you're kind of like, oh gosh, like I've got these buyers that I'm helping and like can't really seem to find them anything. Like, that's kind of weird. And then like again, you're like, okay, well, how can I like reaffirm my views? And then you pull the data and you go, oh, okay, like, yeah, inventory is actually incredibly low. So if you look at it, it's like, if you look at the data, it's telling you months of inventory right now across Greater Vancouver is still up. It's inched higher from August. It's at like 5.7 months of inventory, which is actually really quite high. Single family detached, I think, is around 7.5 months of inventory, which is really, really high. But then you look at the total number of houses that are actually on the market for sale, and it's really, really low. So what you have is a scenario where like the demand is incredibly weak. I think you have a lot of buyers that are actually out there that don't actually have things to buy. And so it's funny because John and I, we were chatting before we hit record on this. I was late to the interview, is because I was just getting off a call with a client that's looking at a house on the west side of Vancouver here. It just hit the market 4 days ago. They like it, they want to offer on it, but they've got a certain price in mind. And they go, well, this is the price we want to pay. And I said, well, you had 25 groups through it the first 3 days. Why? And they're trying to wrap their heads around like, why is it so busy? Well, why does this house have 25 groups through it? It's because it's one of the only like nice houses that's actually come to market in the last 6 weeks. And so it's like the price should actually, I was telling them, I was like, yeah, I agree with you. Like the price should actually be lower. You should be able to negotiate a couple $100,000 off this house. But the problem is it's just hit the market and they had 25 groups there. And to be honest, it's probably going to sell in the next couple of days. So we are contending with like, I would say demand is still weak, but the problem is that low inventory is basically offsetting what would otherwise be, I think, a weaker market with lower prices. So it's to John's point, what's happening in Toronto sounds like what's happening here, which is that prices to me feel like they kind of like hit this standstill where we had the huge drop 10, 15, 20% in some markets. And now we're kind of in a scenario where prices seem to be more or less holding a lot more firm.
And that sounds, thanks, Steve. That sounds like what you've been talking about, John, in a couple of your updates on our Move Smartly channel. Why would prices be leveling off in a market in which, you know, sales are at a historical low? Secondly, why aren't listings piling up, which is what you would normally expect in these conditions? So is this quite odd?
I mean, I find it a little bit odd. I would have expected more inventory on the market, quite frankly, after like so many months of such low volume of sales. But again, I think a lot of this is that sellers are not panicked. A few of them are listing, and the ones that are listing more recently are very patient. And if they're not getting the price they want, they just take them off the market. Like I ran some stats last month where we looked at all the homes that got listed between May and July. And we said, okay, how many of these homes actually sold by the end of the summer and how many were canceled? And it was amazing because if we looked at the share of listings that were just canceled was like 45% for condos and something like 38% for houses, which is very high, which just tells you like, you know, they're not moving. They'd rather, and especially the condo owners, they'd rather just rent it out and they're just taking it off the market and they don't care, you know, and that's obviously in some ways providing some stability or floor, at least for now, for prices.
And in Toronto, the condo prices are just bumping up. After those COVID discounts, it's now rocketing to match what rents were before COVID and now even getting higher. Is that the story? Yeah, is that the story in Vancouver, Steve?
Yeah, the rental market, I mean, rents are definitely a lot higher than like COVID or pre-COVID even. So the rental market it's been on fire. Rents are definitely at record highs. They've climbed significantly. You know, I've heard a lot of horror stories from people of our clients even that have opted to sell, get liquid in order to say upsize into something larger. And because you've got that gap, they've actually, you know, had to go and rent places while they wait for like better deals and opportunities with their cash in hand. And they're having, a lot of them have been having a tough time, you know, finding decent rental options at reasonable pricing. You know, we've heard of, you know, again, more applications for certain rentals than actual supply out there. So I am finding personally, I don't know what's happening in Toronto, but like I am finding, I think the rental pricing anecdotally seems to me like it's kind of like topping out. Like I don't think we basically was seeing like every month like the rents seemed like they were going up. I think that they've kind of topped out, but like the rental market from a vacancy perspective remains incredibly tight. But yeah, to John's point as well, same thing here. We are seeing sellers pulling listings off the market. You know, they're not getting the prices. They're getting, again, offers. Obviously, buyers want deals today. I get it, makes sense. And so the offers aren't really matching sellers' expectations, and they're saying, pull it, which kind of goes counterintuitive to what like everybody sort of views. And sometimes this is my view as well, which is like, hey, there's all this debt in Canada. Rates are up at 5%. Everybody's gonna like be forced to like offload their property and flood the market. And like, we're not seeing that. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a story in 12 months if rates stay at these levels, maybe they keep going up. Like that could be a story that then comes to fruition. But right now, sellers are digging their heels in. They're pulling inventory off the market. That's basically providing a floor under the pricing. And so that's a really interesting dynamic. Now, John, I'm curious your thoughts, because one thing I've been saying, you know, to some of our clients is like a little bit of this kind of reminds me of sort of 2017, where okay, let's say the detached market like peaked. Sellers basically tried to list sort of at older prices. They couldn't get it, so they basically took it off the market and said, let's try again in, you know, the spring of 2018. And what happened was the market actually ended up moving a little bit lower. And so they're like, they actually, some of them were forced or basically capitulated and said, okay, you know what, let's sell it. You know, we waited 6 months or a year. We don't want to wait any longer. Or we saw some people that actually started the listing in 2017 and they were on and off the market for like 2 years before eventually selling in like 2019 at like a lower price than what they could have got had they just accepted the first offer that came in 2017.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's going to happen, potentially happen. Obviously, if we see prices dip a little bit further, but I think that's like a dynamic that impacts people who need/wants to move to another home. Like I find a lot of the sellers who are digging in now and just renting have zero intention of selling in a year or two. Like or needs to sell in a year or two. I think they just said, you know what, I can't get the price. I'm just going to hold on to this for like 5 or 6 years. Like that's my instinct. I don't think they are desperate to sell it in 2 years. You know what I mean? But again, we'll see.
Yeah, they'd be part of like the well-capitalized sort of investors. And
yeah,
I think what happens, I think we tend to hear like a lot of the sort of like the doom stories of like, you know, personal finance Reddit threads and stuff like that, where I've seen it here as well anecdotally, is like some of the investors that have like levered up, right? That have like tapped the home equity line to buy like a second rental property. Like those, I think, are the people that, yeah, they're not going to be able to pull it and sit on it for 5 years. But I think there is a huge cohort of Canadians that, again, are mortgage free.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. I mean, and listen, I mean, we were talking about this in our sales meeting today. Like, yeah, some people are taking money out of HELOCs to buy investment properties, but the few people I know who do that have virtually no mortgage, right? Or have a $300,000 mortgage on a $2 million home. So are they the high leveraged investor if they take 200 grand out and buy a property? I mean, not really, because their incomes are still high. They can more than cover it. I mean, I suspect that that's the majority. I think the minority are the ones who are like completely maxed out on debt. You know, the ones that we hear about and see about who have like debt from private lenders and have bought 4 pre-construction properties that they have no ability to close on. I think those are probably the minority, is my instinct.
Interesting. So I think we're going to touch on that, John. You've had even discussions with banking sector officials on what they're thinking in terms of that mortgage exposure or risky or distressed exposure might look like. So I think we'll get to that in a second or two in response to a couple of viewer questions. We got a lot this month, so that's fabulous. Before we get to that, let's do our usual interest rate corner. But instead of the same old, let's have a look before we discuss the Bank of Canada raising rates, which you both expected. That did happen since we last talked. I thought we'd look a little bit around the world because, on the same front, some really interesting things are happening. So let's go to the UK. Man, I think officials around the world would like to send a check to the Conservative-led government, Liz Truss, and her colleagues, who got themselves into a bit of a bind, making, I guess, other people look a little less confused. In the UK, a mini budget was announced on September 23rd. The government announced a wide range of tax cuts, including on some of the top tier earners, that would have to be funded by borrowing. This was among other measures. Interestingly, there was a small measure there for first-time buyers. But this budget was widely panned by the markets. This led to funds market reaction. The bond market then shot up. The yields, shot up. The Bank of England was then forced to, instead of starting the quantitative tightening that they wanted to do, they actually had to go in there and buy bonds in an emergency measure in the long term to shore that up. And that resulted in a mess in the mortgage market, where for a few days, borrowers saw their offers and potential renewals being rescinded as mortgage providers started to try to reprice what they could offer rates at. So all in all, that ended, I think, a day or two ago with the UK government walking back their announced tax cut for the highest bracket. So like I said, a bit of a gift to other politicians around the world who seems to be struggling in this really odd time. Steve, I know you and your colleagues at the Looney Hour podcast focus on macroeconomic issues, and how they might impact Canadians. So I wanted to ask you to help us unpack what the heck happened here. Why did a loss of confidence in the macroeconomic policies of the UK lead to this impact on mortgage borrowers?
Yeah, I guess, maybe not like the foremost expert on this, but I'll kind of give like the simplified version of how, can impact Canadians and sort of lessons learned, which is basically to your point, Ermi, which is, okay, the UK is already dealing with double-digit inflation. There's been some predictions that inflation could hit as high as 15 to 20% this year. So anytime you start, basically on the fiscal side, reducing taxes, there was a concern that, okay, this might actually spur even more inflation. And so the bond market basically instantly repriced that and said, oh my gosh, like basically bondholders want to be compensated with higher yields, right? So yields basically shot up. The currency as a result, started to fall. And so there basically became very little liquidity in the bond market in the UK. And so when there's very little liquidity, right, yields basically show up. There was no basically bids for these government bonds, right? So the central bank, the Bank of England, had to come in and purchase a lot of this government debt, which kind of goes counterintuitive because central banks right now are trying to drain liquidity, which is basically selling off government debt, not purchasing it and adding, more sort of juice into the market. So that's kind of the simplified version. And so it's kind of a telltale sign where it's like, for example, the federal government here in Canada, what we've been talking a lot about is, the Liberal government saying, oh, we're going to mail out checks to households and we're going to give free dental care. And like, that sounds great. But when you're trying to sort of tighten financial conditions and you're trying to bring inflation down, that kind of goes counterintuitive to what the central banks are trying to do. So they're like, they're competing. The federal government is competing now against the central bank, and right. So this is creating this issue. So it's like the more that the government tries to like fix the problem by spending more money and mailing out checks, the harder these central banks are having to work on fighting inflation. So I think it's unfortunately we have to go through some pain, which is like we need to go through a little bit of austerity. We need to go through a little bit of job losses in order to get inflation down, and hopefully by doing that, these higher rates can hopefully then slowly start to come down. So that's kind of like the bigger picture. Certainly, I'm sure the Bank of Canada has been watching exactly what's going on over in the UK.
Right, I wonder if the Liberals are almost sending notes of thank you to the UK, because the issue in a nutshell, as you're saying, is that while we're all, the average person is suffering due to inflationary pressures, when governments try to step in to help us through either giving us payments, like the Liberal government in Canada announced $500 to renters, or in the UK promising massive tax cuts, this in turn leads to fears that this might add to the inflation that the central banks are trying to fight. So it becomes a little bit of a cycle. And my understanding is that some of the measures that Canada introduced pale into comparison in terms of what a widespread tax cut would do, which is why probably the UK has walked that back. So moving now to the US, we saw the Fed there on September 21st raise by 0.75 of a percentage point, or 75 basis points, bringing their policy rate to 3.25%. So the same as Canada. And they are warning that there was more, like you said, Steve, more tightening to come. So probably rates would be rising, less trying to protect us from the fallout of some of these things. So Steve and John, given that the US situation is more linked to Canada, what is the implications of the hike there, given that just before in Canada on September 7th, the Bank of Canada raised the exact same amount and brought their policy rate to 3.25, as expected, as you both had expected, and as was widely expected. So we moved up, the Americans have moved up, we're at the same rates. What do you think this means, and what do you think this might entail for Canada's next moves? John?
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Okay.
Or Steve, I'm happy.
So I mean, so certainly we're on a more hikes in the future. I mean, I think a lot of people have come out and are kind of pressuring the feds to kind of slow that down. I mean, both. I mean, I think the IMF and a lot of, I think number of Nobel
United Nations.
Yeah, United Nations
United
as
Nations,
it was. Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, like a lot of economists are suggesting that. Like the challenge, of course, is, I mean, of course they're going to over tighten. I mean, I think we kind of know that, right? But I think the Fed's position is, well, if we don't do that, they're worried that inflation will just stay kind of baked in and stick with us longer. And I think they just, like, both are terrible outcomes. And I think their position is, well, we'd rather just overdo it and kill inflation, no matter what that does to the economy or the housing market, rather than be very moderate. And so, that's happening. I think obviously it's very easy to see the Fed go well above 4. So Canada could easily kind of hit 4% by the end of the year. I mean, I don't know if we necessarily are going to go step in step with the Fed in the US. Like, it's very possible we might be a little bit below them. It looks like, inflation's a little bit more problematic there. The job market's a little bit tighter. Debts loads are even worse. So we're gonna, you don't need as big of a rate hike.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I think we're certainly going to see, rates increase by the end of the year again, for sure.
And interestingly, to that point, on our Move Smartly blog, our mortgage expert reminds us that whereas, in the UK, seeing their pound fall so much against the dollar, they're almost looking at parity, which is like shocking for them, obviously. In Canada, our dynamics vis-a-vis the US dollar is a bit different. Even if our dollar does dip a bit, policymakers tend to like to see that because of our trade relationship with the United States. So it makes our exports more competitive. So there is some thinking that David was sharing, that it's possible Canada might not be not have to hike as steeply as the US. One, because maybe we have started already, and two, maybe the extent of the problems are a little bit different compared to the US. So the next meeting is in October 25th, I think, for the Bank of Canada. Steve, what do you think might happen?
I think that we're going to start to see, I think we're starting to see like the early signs of, again, not a pivot of like, hey, we're cutting rates, but like there's a lot more, again, as we talked about, United Nations, IMF, some big economists, some Fed officials coming out and saying, okay, maybe we need to slow this down. And so I think we're reaching the end of sort of this rate hike cycle. So again, we can still get some more rate hikes, obviously, but I think so one of the ones to look at is like, okay, so you had the Bank of England intervene with quantitative easing. You've had the Bank of Japan doing the same. You've had the Bank of Korea as well. And more recently, the one that's interesting is the Bank of Australia. They have a very similar debt dynamics as Canada, obviously same housing issues. And so they were supposed to hike rates 50 basis points. That's what the market was pricing in. And they came out with a dovish hike of 25 basis points this week. So, and so I think we're a situation where the chatter is starting to increase around, okay, we need to get inflation down, but are we risking a potential financial crisis? And so we saw basically in the UK, right, is that their almost entire pension system almost imploded. That's why the Bank of England actually had to step in. So basically the pension funds were getting margin calls because there's such a quick move in bond yields over in the UK. So, and that obviously there's contagion effects, right? It's never just contained to sort of one entity. And so that's why I think we're starting to see the chat. So I think the Bank of Canada probably still moves in, let's say, October, but like, don't be surprised if instead of 50 basis points, which is what I think is currently priced in, don't be surprised if that's 25 basis points.
Interesting. So that leads us nicely to a question we received for both of you on our Twitter at Move Smartly. Thank you for all the questions. From CND Housing Market asks, what happens to real estate if the Bank of Canada hikes to 4.7%? I'm assuming that's like by the end of the year. And obviously we're discussing what if they would hike to that amount. But let's say they did 4.75% and kept it on that level for 2 years, as is expected by BMO and other banks. And I'm assuming when they say what happens to real estate, what happens to the market and what happens to prices in Canada?
John.
I mean, I don't think most banks are expecting the bank to go to 4 3/4. I mean,
I think it was 3.75 or 4.
Something like that. Yeah. So
yeah, I think the rate
there.
hike is, yeah, it's high there, but I think the viewer is right in saying that they expect things to stay for a bit. So prices went up fast, the rate went up fast, but it's going to be sticky coming down.
It's going to be sticky coming down. I don't know if it's going to go to 4.75. Like I said, I mean, the Fed might, but I don't think Canada will. I mean, but even in the low 4s, I mean, it doesn't make a huge difference. Like, but the issue is, even if we're at 4 or 4.25% for 2 years, yeah, 100%, you're going to see challenges. Like it's going to be a very, very problematic market economically. Like, I don't think we're going to see, you know, I think a lot of people think everyone's just going to hand over their keys and walk away from their home and they can't afford it. Like, I don't see that happening, but you're going to see massive ripple effects economically. Like, the last thing people are going to give up is their home, but they're just going to stop spending on everything else. And yeah, and I do think, of course, some of the very, very highly leveraged households are going to have issues refinancing, especially people with multiple investment properties. They're going to have a hard time affording them. So it's hard to predict because, you know, again, we're at unbelievably high levels of debt and levels of debt that really are hard to finance at, you know, 5+% and 6%. So it's tough to predict, but again, it's I think the big issue is if high rates stay with us for a long time is when all of these issues start becoming problematic.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I know, I would agree. I think, like, John pretty much touched on everything. I think, you know, we talked about this, John, for, I don't know, going on a year plus, all these interviews that we've done, right? Which is like, wait, you know, we always said before, I think it was like before rates were even starting moving, we said once mortgage rates, you know, start getting north of 3.5, the housing market is going to hit the brakes hard. And so, you know, we're at mortgage rates of 5%. And, you know, what are GTA sales again at 20-year lows? Like Vancouver, we were more or less basically at 30-year lows outside of like 2008 and like 2012. And like, we were off by like, you know, 50, 60 sales. So it's like, we're pretty much running at like 30-year lows, more or less, in Vancouver. And that's with basically, you know, you look at second quarter numbers, I mean, record immigration, right? So the fact that sales volumes are at where they are, you know, adjusting for population as well, like, there's very little housing activity. And again, I think that with rates at, even if the Bank of Canada right now, the overnight rate's at 3.25, even if they get to 4, it's going to be really painful for the housing market. And I think for the rest of the economy, because, like, again, even if listings, let's say, continue to get pulled off and inventory remains like relatively modest, that's fine. Prices don't necessarily need to go, but the fact that even of having like no housing turnover, no sales, the knock-on effect of having a completely illiquid housing market for the next, you know, 6, 8, 10, 12 months is going to be painful.
And as I mentioned, that pain is what governments around the world are trying to sort of offset so that voters, you know, feel heard. In Canada, I mentioned that on September 13th, the Justin Trudeau-led federal government announced new spending measures, including that $500 payment for most in-need renters. I just wonder quickly what you two think of this kind of measure and whether it would have an impact. John? I
mean, I think their plan just more broadly, I think, was criticized for some of the reasons we discussed earlier, because it is stimulative. You know, they're pumping money into the economy. Does this make Bank of Canada's job a little bit harder? Again, I don't know, obviously not as significant as what the UK government did. But I mean, what does $500 do for a rental? I mean, honestly, like the other day I actually just posted that the average rent for a condo in Toronto right now is $2,800. Like, rents have just exploded. Like, a one-time check of $500 I mean, is not going to solve anything, and they're making it sound like they solved our rental prices. So I don't think it's gonna. It's a bit of a silly policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I just think, I know it's targeted to like the very, very low end of sort of the income spectrum. So, again, I don't necessarily expect it to be stimulative. But yeah, I mean, they're doing, I guess, I mean, I think like to give them at least a little bit of something here is like, they definitely eased up, the Liberal government has definitely eased up significantly on like their fiscal spending. Because I think they know that they have to, given where inflation is and the political pressure around that. So, I'll give them a little bit of credit there for sure, that the spending has been reined in as it should be. But yeah, again, we're still dealing with basically monetary policy now trying to remove several years of overstimulation, which will be like coming off a sugar high.
Yeah, you're absolutely great analogy. So let's turn to linked other risks for the Canadian housing market in addition to the interest rates. I really thought a recent Toronto Star article by Jenna Moon was good in laying out 3 key areas of concern. And number one was debt levels. So we heard from actually a friend of Move Smartly, Doug Hoyes, a bankruptcy expert, who was quoted on the rather high levels of non-mortgage related consumer debt by Canadians, held by Canadians at present. The Star had this very interesting chart. I believe it's produced from Equifax on average debt per consumer. So this includes things like auto financing and line of credit debt. So this is, again, non-mortgage debt. And they rank cities in terms of what this average amount looks like. Interestingly enough, Alberta cities top the list, with Fort McMurray at an average about $37.5 thousand average debt load. Vancouver coming in at $22.5 thousand average debt load, and Toronto at just over $20,000 average debt load. Montreal is the lowest here at just under $16.5 thousand average debt level. So there, again, concerns about what this might mean. And Steve, I know you mentioned in particular high levels of consumer debt that might make this current situation we're seeing a bit different from past housing downturns. So what are your thoughts on seeing this and starting to see some of the numbers around this?
I just think it's like, to keep things relatively simple, I know everybody likes to compare this era, what's happening right now, to like the 1980s, and interest rates going into the double digits. I really think like when you start to like look at house prices, house price to incomes, debt to GDP levels, a 5 or 6% mortgage rate today, I think, is the equivalent of having, a 14 or 15% mortgage rate in the 1980s, given where debt levels are today and house prices. So I think this is our like 1980s period where people will laugh and say, well, it's 5% mortgage. Like it's high, and there's a reason why sales volumes have collapsed to 20 and 30-year lows in large parts of the country. So that's how I'm looking at it. Just to kind of keep things simple, I think the rate path forward for the Bank of Canada is not as clean and simple as it is for like the US. I mean, the US balance sheets are in way better shape. I would look at Canada a lot more closely to that of like Australia or New Zealand, which is dealing with very high debt levels in the private sector, and obviously very high house prices relative to incomes. And so I think that's kind of how I'm looking at things.
Interesting. And the article mentions too that in Canada, the second big issue is mortgage debt. But interestingly here, Canadians tend to tighten on every other area to keep themselves in their homes. But looking at the issue of mortgage debt, if you look at that in combination with high non-mortgage debt and other issues, you start to wonder, could we start to see Canadians having difficulty making mortgage payments given this combo of high interest rates and the existing debt levels? And John, I believe you had some interesting conversations lately with banking sector experts on how much trouble Canadian mortgage holders could be getting into, or what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the consensus is generally that like most mortgage borrowers for big banks, are going to kind of weather the storm. And there are a lot of options I think that banks can do. And of course, one of the big ones is, if someone's mortgage is coming up for renewal, I suspect, and I think this is going to probably start happening, where banks will start being able to extend amortizations for buyers, or not for buyers, for people with existing homes that are renewing. So if you're renewing your mortgage and your payment goes from $3,000 to $4,500, well, to soften that, they'll just extend the amortization to lower your payment to make it a little bit easier. So I suspect this is some of the things that I think even policymakers are going to be looking at doing to soften the blow of this boom in interest rates. Because again, banks, obviously, nobody wants people walking away from their homes. I mean, it's not good economically. It's not good for our financial system. So again, but certainly, I mean, there are going to be some households that are going to be distressed if we see job losses as we move into the new year. A combination of losing your job and having much higher payments or higher payments is going to be challenging for some households. But I don't think it's going to be comparative to what we saw, for example, during the US financial crisis, where people were just walking away from homes and mailing their lender the keys and just giving up. I don't think that's going to happen. But we'll see. I mean, I think most households should be okay.
We got a lot. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Just to say, I think that's an important point, because I know there's like a cohort, and I get this feedback all the time. I get it. Like, people are, naturally frustrated with like how high house prices are, especially the younger generation. And so they, John, they're probably listening to you and saying, "Oh my gosh, please stop intervening in the housing market. Just let the free market do its thing, and let prices come down, and people that need to, that can't afford their payment, they just need to sell and go rent or whatever." Like, there's a cohort of people that have that viewpoint. I totally understand it. I think I would just point out that, like, I think it's naive to think that, like, I just try to think and say, how do policymakers actually think and behave? And like, I think we saw this in, like, not only this during the onset of the pandemic, which was, hey, don't worry about paying your mortgage. You can defer it for 6 months. Don't worry about it. The goalposts are always moving. And so, like, this was always a little bit of my argument. And the goalposts, we saw it in England, right? Like, okay, inflation at 10%, but like when the Bank of England had to come in and start soaking up more of the government debt, they did. And so in Canada, again, to your point, like, there are ongoing conversations about allowing existing borrowers to just simply re-amortize and extend their mortgage. And that would be a change of the rules. So the goalposts are consistently and always moving. And one of the ones that's on the table being discussed as well, I don't know if it's going to happen for sure, but every December, OSFI makes or announces what they're going to do with the stress test. And so there's been discussions about, okay, do we potentially lower the stress test this December because rates are at 14-year highs and we think it's done its job. So I think just important to understand that policymakers don't always tend to do the right thing. They do what is politically palatable, and I think the goalposts are always moving.
Right. And to be fair, to ease, I mean, there is something about easing the average person's concerns if they can weather that storm. To that point, we got to your questions about mortgages. I think they're quite specific. I'm going to ask them quickly. But because I do think it speaks to how, I guess, concerned people are right now. It is a very concerning time. So from @Bucks&Cents, the question is, in terms of percentages for mortgage terms, is there any sense of how many people are in 1, 2, 3 versus 5-year terms? In other words, when is the biggest wave of renewals expected and could be subject to these higher rates? John, did anything shake out in your discussions with banking experts on this?
No, and I don't have stats on that. I mean, I don't know. I think we do know, like, the B lenders, the private lenders are all generally 1 to 2 year mortgages, so those will roll over. I think I saw Ron Butler post that I think he said that's about 6% of the market or something like that. So not huge, but I mean, it's still significant. 6% of the market turning over is still, I mean, especially if they're kind of the most vulnerable, if you want to think about it, it's still significant.
Right. Yeah. And especially if you locked in at very low rates. I mean, 1 or 2 years ago. So, Steve, any ideas on that?
Yeah, our buddy Ron Butler has posted this before. Obviously, very big in the mortgage broker space. I think the most standard term is like 5-year, whether it's a 5-year variable or 5-year fixed rate mortgage. So I know Ron's post this. It's not like we don't have the exact number, but it's basically 20 to 25% of all mortgages outstanding renew each year, which makes sense, right? Like if it's the 5-year term, it makes sense that 20% of mortgages outstanding would renew each year. So it's more or less, I think, in that ballpark of 20 to 25% of all mortgages.
Thanks, that's helpful. Second question quickly from at Frank Greco one. When it's time for a homeowner to refinance, if somebody uses the same bank, do they require the borrower to requalify, or is it an automatic process? No requalifying at the higher interest rate. This is actually an interesting question, John.
If you're just renewing your mortgage, you don't requalify. But if you want to refinance, take out more debt, recap, all of that stuff, then yeah, they look at the stress that you have to kind of requalify for that mortgage. They want to make sure that you can handle it, the additional debt. But if you just want to roll over your mortgage into a new term, no, they don't kind of, you don't have to go through a whole requalification process.
Hey, quick note on that as well, because I get this question quite a bit, and John, I'm sure you do too, which is, as long as if you're one of the larger Canadian banks, as long as you are current in your mortgage payment, it's an auto renewal. Okay, so they don't really care that like, oh, your house dropped 25% in value, and you lost your job or you changed jobs and you make less money. They don't care. They send you an automatic renewal letter in the mail. And so as long as you stick with that lender and don't change any of the terms, you're good. So that's an important sort of note.
Yeah, I think that is helpful information to know right now. And you already covered this, both of you. The last issue that the Toronto Star article by Jenna Moon touched on is the chance of a recession. So that's another risk that we could be seeing if we do go into a recession, and that entails job losses. The question we got from a viewer at Toonsa's Dog, I'm hoping I'm not saying anything untoward with any of these handles. So if I am passing along non-child friendly language, I apologize, but I think that's okay. The question from them is, now that recession is pretty much guaranteed, how low will housing prices go? That's really open-ended. But
I got the crystal ball. I mean, I don't know, man. It's honestly so hard, and I think it's impossible to predict. And kind of one thing I'm going to be looking at a conference, I'll probably do a video on this over the next little while, is, the way I like to think about the market is that, I don't do forecasts. I'm not an economist. It's impossible to predict. But, I want to think about, the goods, if there are goods, the things that might keep prices stable, the things that might be bad, and the things that might be terrible, right? And what are the different scenarios? Because it helps us look for those signs as we move forward in the months ahead. So it's impossible to predict. There are just different things that can happen. And there is a case where prices are stable now, which most people would not have predicted, right? But they are, for whatever reason. So what do they look like 6 months from now? Again, is a function of how distressed the market is, how many jobs are lost, what sector are they lost in? I mean, if they're disproportionately lost in among people who are renters versus household homeowners, which is what we saw during COVID, obviously the dynamics are very different, right? So it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. I think we just have to kind of monitor things real time. My 2 cents.
I would say, I guess, I don't have any same with John. Like my viewpoint, like my base case is, I think like prices continue to edge lower. I think it's more of a trickle lower from here. Like it could be like we've talked on the show before, like maybe it's like prices just like move sideways to down for the next like 12 to 18 months. And like we're down another 10% over that period, potentially. I don't know, but like that's more of my base case. I will say that like right now, year to date, we're down 12% on the home price index from the peak. I know CMHC, ironically enough, not to bash them too often, but like they just updated their forecast, or apparently they're updating it and they're saying, oh, national prices will drop 10 to 15% from the peak into the middle of next year. And it's like, well, again, we're already down 12%. So it's like, this isn't even like a prediction. They're basically just telling you what already happened. But even at 12% on a national basis, it's now the steepest correction on record dating back to 2005 when that home price index was created. So just to put things into context, this is already like a historical correction. And obviously it'll be interesting to see if it continues. I think it does, but probably not to the extent I know that a lot of housing bears are obviously, looking for.
Yeah, I mean, and the GTA is down about 24% already. So we're kind of leading most of the country, I would say, in terms of decline. And I have to agree with Steve. I mean, if anything happens, I mean, I don't think there's a bullish narrative over the next couple of years. Like the bullish narrative is the potential flatlining, right? Because I don't think anything's going to lead to a rebound in prices anytime soon. But I mean, I agree with Steve. If anything happens over the next couple of years, it's flat to a slow decline, and then maybe prices stick for a couple of years or something like that. Because again, we're probably gonna have high rates with us for quite a while.
I think that's an important point, because sorry to interrupt you. Because I get a lot of clients and people that ask me this. They go, oh, like everyone's just like waiting for like the Bank of Canada to like pivot, right? So it's like there's a belief, or maybe like a concern that, oh my gosh, as soon as they pivot, like house prices are instantly gonna like turn directions, pull a 180, and like we're gonna go, we're back up to whatever, even if it's 5% annual price growth. And like I think that's a little bit naive. Like even if we get like that pivot, like could you still be in a flat market for like 3, 4, 5 years? Like we don't know, but I think it's the realities, or the probabilities, would say, of like a sudden change in directions, I think are extremely low.
I mean, listen, I think what there's going to be a slight change in direction probably end of next year. But like we said, we've gone from 1/4 points to probably 4% within 9 months. Okay. We're not going to see the same if we're going down. We're going to go from 25 basis points at a time. It's going to be far slower. And I think the impact that's going to have on the market is not going to be nearly as significant. And I think that's what maybe a lot of people are misreading. They think, oh, the bank's going to slash rates by like 100 basis points. I don't think it's going to be that quick. And I think that's why we're not going to see a huge rebound. Again, I mean, just a guess, but I don't think it's going to be a rapid decline in rates.
Interesting. So yeah, times we haven't seen in a long time, conditions we haven't seen in a long time. I thought we'd round things out with some viewer questions I liked around how what we're seeing in real estate might change Canada more generally, the geography more specifically. Great question to the Move Smartly Twitter channel at Move Smartly from @Aaron Solomon. And thank you, Aaron, for using your name, so I don't have to worry about swearing accidentally. How long will it take until Dryden and Ignace, hopefully I'm saying that right, are considered part of the GTA housing market? So I believe that's the town, those are townships, small areas. John, I think this is for you.
Yeah.
They're really north.
Yeah, Northwestern. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, because I mean, obviously, I mean, I don't think he's serious, but there's actually some truth to it, because what has happened. And, we saw statistics from Statistics Canada, this mass exodus of people from Ontario moving to Alberta, moving to the Maritimes, and even within Ontario, moving to smaller towns for affordability reasons. Mike Moffat, his economist, had a very similar kind of Twitter post recently where he basically said the same thing. And what's happening is these people from Toronto who can't afford GTA or even the greater Golden Horseshoe are moving to the East Coast, are moving to these small rural towns up north, are moving to smaller communities, and they're distorting housing markets there, because not only because of their salaries, because those markets don't need a big spike in demand to push prices up, which is partly why East Coast prices exploded. All you need are hundreds of more buyers to move over there to kind of distort the housing market. So it is happening, and the dynamics, the high prices in the GTA, quite frankly, are affecting housing markets now across Canada, as we see. I mean, Alberta has this classic campaign trying to lure Torontonians to Alberta. And one of their big pitches is you can afford a home, right? And it's not a small thing to say that you can afford a home. So I think it's already happening where GTA is kind of distorting housing markets across Canada.
That leads to my next question that I wanted to end on for Steve. I did see those ads in Toronto subway. I believe the campaign is called Alberta is Calling, and their ads targeting Ontarians at looking at moving out to Alberta. There was a recent column in, I believe it's the Globe and Mail's Decoder feature, which looks at one chart and sort of takes us through some economic data. And it did show that while Ontario continues to see immigration, it saw the largest net outflow of people in 6+ decades in the second quarter. And they lost about 25, that represents 21,000 people going to other provinces, where at the same time, Alberta measured its largest net inflow, close to 10,000 people, with around 12,700 people from Toronto alone. So maybe it's working. I wonder, Steve, do you see those ads in Vancouver?
Yeah,
Alberta
we actually we got them quite a bit. They're on the radio and whatnot. So it's a huge campaign. It was certainly part of my like sort of bullish sort of Calgary narrative, because again, if we were just making hypotheticals here, again, if Greater Vancouver and Greater Toronto just kept going up in perpetuity, 10% a year, no one would be able to afford to live there. So like they'd have to go somewhere. And I think I think we're seeing like these migration patterns, not just from Canada, which are now starting to happen, but I think we've been seeing them in the US for the last like 5-10 years, right? Like where have people been going in the US? They've been going to like these Sun Belt areas, low taxes, more affordable living, you get more house for less dollars. And so to me, it felt always like somewhat of an inevitable. And so, yeah, I think like Alberta is clearly doubling down on that. That is kind of the draw, right? Lower taxes, cheaper housing. And I think like we are in a situation where, even in the GTA, right? Cost of house prices are coming down, but they're not really getting more affordable. I mean, mortgage rates are at 5%. Like your payments arguably higher today than it was back in January. So we're still going to be dealing with, I think, housing affordability challenges 5-10 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
For a very long time. And they're coming down from such an already eye-watering price. The disconnect between income and home prices and even rents we've talked about. So this will be an issue for a long time to come. And as Mike Moffat and other economists point out, it could also result in a change in character in Canada. And that would be interesting to see what that might look like. So I'm so pleased to receive so many more of your questions. We are out of time for this week, but I want to reassure everybody, we loved your questions. We'll categorize them and try to answer some of them in future episodes of our roundtable as we respond to different themes. So please keep it coming. You could reach Move Smartly on Twitter at Move Smartly. John and Steve also have normal handles, so at John Pasalis and at Steve Saretsky at Twitter. So keep your questions and comments coming. And on our YouTube channel, you're welcome to do the same at Move Smartly. So thank you guys. This was a lively discussion, lots to cover. Thank you.
Till next time.
That was really good. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.